Morning on the bank of the Nile. Pharaoh walks to the water's edge in the cool of the dawn, trailing his royal retinue, when an 80-year-old shepherd steps forward, lifts a wooden staff, and brings it down hard on the surface of the river. The water shudders, it ripples, it turns heavy, thick, and dark. It does not just change color, it turns into actual, clotting blood. But look closely at what happens next. The plague does not stop at the banks. It does not stay in the wild. It creeps into the quiet, domestic spaces of the empire, bleeding into vessels of wood and stone. The fish suffocate and rot. The stench rises over the palaces of Memphis. It is the first strike against the greatest empire on earth, and it is brutally calculated. Because the first plague did not merely ruin the drinking water of Egypt, it forced the Nile to publicly resurrect an 80-year-old mass grave. Picture it, the grand artery of the ancient world, the vein that gave life to millions, suddenly dying in real time. Listen to the exact parameters of the strike. Exodus chapter 7, verses 19 and 20. King James Version lays out the terrifying scope of the command. And the Lord spake unto Moses, say unto Aaron, Take thy rod, and stretch out thine hand upon the waters of Egypt, upon their streams, upon their rivers, and upon their ponds, and upon all their pools of water, that they may become blood, and that there may be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Stop right there. Read that again. The text is exhaustive. Streams, rivers, ponds, pools, even the water already drawn, already sitting inside the house, trapped in wooden buckets and stone jars. The blood is entirely inescapable. The staff hits the water, and an empire chokes. Same river, same banks. But now, the lifeblood of Egypt carries the thick, unmistakable stench of human death. See the scene from outside the Bible. The Ipuwer Papyrus, an ancient secular Egyptian text, records a nation breaking apart under an inexplicable ancient catastrophe. The scribe writes, Plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. The river is blood. If you drink of it, you lose your humanity and thirst for water. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. I offer it as that, one tradition's record. But the secular parallel is chilling. An Egyptian scribe, watching his eternal river turn into an open wound. But why blood? God could have turned the river to dust. He could have turned it to salt, or poison, or ash. He does not waste miracles on random spectacle. The strike is surgical. The Nile was not just water to Pharaoh. It was a divine being, the source of all prosperity. Yet this first judgment was doing something deeper than just killing the water. It was bringing a buried secret to the surface. The water is dead, the fish are rotting, and the river is bleeding out under the morning sun. But to understand what the wooden staff actually woke up in the current, we have to look at the entity Pharaoh was praying to when Moses found him. Who was the spirit in the river, and what exact crime was the God of the Hebrews avenging? Pharaoh stands on the edge of the Nile at dawn. He is not there for a morning stroll. He is there to perform the sacred rites of an empire. Exodus chapter 7, verse 15, gives Moses the exact intercept coordinates. Get thee unto Pharaoh in the morning. Lo, he goeth out unto the water. And thou shalt stand by the river's brink against he come. Stop right there. Look at the timing. Why is the living king of Egypt walking to the riverbank at first light? He is going out to commune with Hapi, the Egyptian deity of the Nile, the bringer of life and the lord of the fishes. To the Egyptian mind, the river was not merely a natural resource. It was a living, breathing, divine vein. When Moses' rod strikes the surface, it is not a parlor trick. It is a targeted execution. Watch what the text does. Yahweh does not ask Pharaoh for permission to share the land. He publicly assassinates Pharaoh's god in front of his royal court. The life-giver is instantly transformed into a carrier of death. The fish suffocate, the current thickens, and the shoreline itself holds a buried clue. In the Hebrew text of verse 15, the word translated brink or bank is sapphire. It means a physical edge, yes, but its primary, overwhelming meaning throughout the Old Testament is lip or speech. Moses is not just standing on the mud. He is standing on the lip of the river, and the river is about to speak, reading, not inventing. The Nile is about to open its mouth. There is an older layer to this conflict. Recorded in the Book of Jubilees, this ancient text, called the Little Genesis by the early church, and kept whole for centuries inside the Ethiopian Bible, frames the Exodus not just as a political liberation, but as a cosmic war. It maps the plagues as deliberate, systematic takedowns of the demonic princes operating behind the Egyptian throne. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. Test it the way the Bereans tested everything. But Jubilees paints a spiritual reality where the Nile was the literal throne of a dark principality, and Moses just turned that throne into a slaughterhouse. We assume the plague of blood was merely a tactical siege meant to starve the Egyptians of drinking water, but thirst takes days to break a man. The horror of the blood was immediate. Look at the King James text in verse 21. And the fish that was in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. The stench, the smell of rotting flesh, rising up and filling the stone corridors of Memphis. The blood was not just a deprivation of water, it was an indictment. Sit with that. It was a message written in the exact medium Egypt had weaponized against the Hebrews. In the book of Ezekiel, God speaks of Pharaoh as the great dragon that lieth in the midst of his rivers, which hath said, My river is mine own, and I have made it for myself. Ezekiel 29:3. Pharaoh claimed the water. He claimed he owned it, so the God of heaven gave it back to him, thick and ruined. But the blood filling the riverbed was not just a display of supernatural power. It was a very specific, historical accusation reaching back across decades. What exact, unspeakable crime had the currents of the Nile been hiding for 80 long years? 80 years before Moses strikes the water, Egyptian soldiers march along these exact banks, carrying screaming Hebrew infants. They do not use swords. They do not build pyres. They use the current. The water swallows the boys, washing the tiny bodies away into the reeds and out to the delta. The surface smooths over. The empire sleeps. Exodus chapter 1, verse 22, records the royal decree that built this silent graveyard. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. Stop right there. The river was not merely a natural boundary. It was the murder weapon of the state. For decades, the Nile operated as an unquiet tomb. Now, look at the very first murder in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 10, when Cain kills Abel and buries him in the dirt, God says, The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Read that again in the Hebrew. The word for blood in that verse is plural, damim, bloods. The ancient rabbis teach this means Cain did not just kill Abel. He killed every unborn generation that would have come from his brother's line. The earth cannot conceal damim. It speaks. Bring that theology back to the shores of Egypt. The Nile had absorbed the damim of thousands of Hebrew sons. The riverbed was lined with their forgotten bones. The surface looked clean, reflecting the morning sun, but the water was carrying an 80-year debt. Picture it. When the wooden rod hits the water in Exodus 7, the transformation is not a random horror. It is a terrifying exhumation. God forces the river to vomit up its hidden crime. Same river, same victims. The water turns to blood, because the water was already filled with blood. It is the lifeblood of the Hebrew children, suddenly rendered visible to the very empire that drowned them. The plague is a mirror. The Book of Jasher, an ancient Jewish historical record named twice in the canonical Old Testament, expands on the sheer volume of this slaughter. It describes Egyptian guards tearing children from their mothers' arms, casting them into the rushing current while the women stood weeping on the shoreline. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. But the memory of that endless slaughter is exactly what the plague resurrects. The New Testament book of Revelation confirms this exact divine logic. In Revelation 16, an angel pours a vial upon the sea, turning it to the blood of a dead man. Listen to the justification in verse 6. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. The Egyptians are forced to look at what they have done. They are forced to smell the decay of their own decree. They are forced to press their lips to the consequence. Reading, not inventing. The judgment perfectly matches the crime. The river is dead, but the horror has already moved indoors. A dark contagion is bypassing the banks and bleeding into the deepest domestic spaces of the empire. Why did the plague suddenly manifest inside sealed vessels of wood and stone? A heavy, sun-baked room in the heart of Memphis. An Egyptian servant tips a carved stone pitcher to pour morning water for her master. The water was drawn from the Nile the night before, clear and cool. But the liquid that spills over the rim is thick, warm, and dark red. She drops the pitcher. The stone shatters, and the blood pools across the floor. The plague has broken the banks. It has bypassed the gates. It has entered the bedroom. Listen to the strangest, most specific detail in the decree. Moses does not just curse the open water. In Exodus chapter 7, verse 19, the King James Version records the exact coordinates of the strike, that there may be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Stop right there. Read that again. The word vessels is actually italicized in your King James Bible. The translators added it to make the sentence flow in English. The literal Hebrew is much sharper, much more terrifying. The blood will be ba'etzu ba'eben, in the wood and in the stone. This means the water that was already separated from the river, locked safely inside the house, transformed simultaneously. The judgment did not travel downstream like a natural algae bloom or a red tide. It bypassed the laws of nature. It broke into the domestic sanctuary, same water, same blood. But why does the text single out wood and stone? The God of the Hebrews does not waste words. Throughout the Old Testament, these two exact materials are paired together for one specific reason. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 36, God warns that a rebellious people will be driven away to serve other gods, wood and stone. The invasion is total. Egypt was a nation saturated in domestic idolatry. Every home had shrines. Every family had statues carved from timber and rock, holding bowls of ritual water meant to purify the household. When Aaron's rod hit the river, it did not just kill the Nile. It walked right into the Egyptian living room and desecrated the altars. The water in the sacred bowls turned to human death. Picture it. The gods of the household could not even protect the water sitting in their own wooden hands. Ancient Jewish commentary pushes this nightmare even further. The Midrash Rabbah, a collection of early rabbinic teachings on the Torah, records that the plague did not just affect the liquid inside the jars. The rabbis teach that the literal statues of Egypt, the idols carved from wood and stone, began to sweat and weep actual blood. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. Test it the way the Bereans tested everything, but the theology of the claim is flawless. The false gods were bleeding out. The empire was being dismantled from the inside. The rivers were rotting. The household jars were filled with gore. The domestic gods were dripping with the evidence of a buried crime. But a catastrophe this massive could not be hidden in the pages of the Bible alone. If an entire nation lost its water supply, and the artery of the ancient world ran, thick with human blood, the empire would have been forced to write it down. What did the secular scribes of Egypt secretly carve into their own surviving records while their empire gagged on the smell of death? Deep inside a dimly lit scribal chamber in Memphis, a man named Ipuwer drags a reed pen across a long sheet of papyrus. The air outside his window is thick with the inescapable scent of rotting fish. He is not writing theology. He is not writing a religious hymn. He is writing a desperate, secular state report as his civilization collapses around him. The document he is drafting will eventually be buried, lost for centuries, and rediscovered in the modern era. It is known today as the Ipuwer Papyrus, officially catalogued as Papyrus Leiden I, 344. It is a chilling, extra-biblical witness to the very days the book of Exodus describes. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. I offer it as that, one tradition's record. But the ink on the page is impossible to ignore. Listen to what Ipuwer records. Indeed, the river is blood, yet one drinks of it. Men shrink from tasting. Human beings thirst after water. He writes of a nation turned upside down, of a sudden and violent reversal of order. Indeed, plague is throughout the land, blood is everywhere, the towns are destroyed. Now lay that secular Egyptian papyrus next to the canonical text, Exodus chapter 7, verse 21, King James Version. And the fish that was in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. Stop right there. Read that again. Two different authors, two different sides of the war, one exact same nightmare. The secular scribe does not mention Moses. He does not mention the God of the Hebrews. He only records the raw, unexplainable trauma of the water. Men shrinking from the taste. Blood everywhere. Same river, same blood. Watch what the text does when you cross-examine the two records. Notice the strange phrasing in Ipuwer's account. Yet one drinks of it. Men shrink from tasting. It sounds like a paradox. They shrink from it, yet they drink it. But the Hebrew text of Exodus explains this perfectly. The root word for could not drink in verse 18 is la'ah. It does not mean a simple refusal. It means to be exhausted, to weary oneself to the point of breaking. It implies a desperate, failing effort. Picture it. The Egyptians were so mad with thirst, they were cupping their hands, scooping up the gore, trying to force it down their throats, and violently rejecting it. Reading, not inventing. The secular record and the Hebrew grammar locked together perfectly. The river had been their mother. Now she was a rotting corpse. The Ipuwer Papyrus proves this was not a localized myth or a symbolic fable. The destruction was so total, so geographically massive, it broke the back of the Egyptian infrastructure. The state scribes were forced to document the public execution of their own river god. But inside the palace, Pharaoh is not reading Ipuwer's grief. He is standing over a stone basin of blood, flanked by his highest occult priests. He is not looking for repentance. He is looking for a counterstrike. The empire is documenting its own ruin, but the throne refuses to bow. Pharaoh calls his shadow workers to the floor to answer the Hebrew prophet, But when the dark magicians of Egypt finally move their hands over the water, why do they replicate the nightmare instead of ending it? Torches flicker in the stone halls of the royal court. Pharaoh stands motionless, watching as his chief sorcerers step forward, their hands hovering over a rare, unpolluted bowl of well water. They begin to chant, whispering the low, guttural syllables of the Egyptian dark arts. The clear water in the basin twists. It thickens. It turns to dark, clotting blood. Pharaoh smiles. Exodus chapter 7, verse 22, King James Version, records the exact response of the throne. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, neither did he hearken unto them, as the Lord had said. Stop right there. Read that again. Think about the utter, blinding foolishness of this miracle. The entire nation is dying of thirst. The grand artery of the empire is rotting under the sun. The domestic vessels of wood and stone are filled with gore. The people are desperate for a single drop of clean water. If Pharaoh's magicians actually possess sovereign spiritual power, the ultimate display of dominance would be to reverse the curse. They should have turned the blood back into water. They should have healed the land. Instead, they just make the plague worse. They take the tiny fraction of clean water left and destroy it. Same spell, same destruction. Why? To answer that, we must look at who these men actually were. The King James text leaves them anonymous in Exodus, but there is an ancient Aramaic translation and rabbinic commentary called Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. It names these two shadow workers explicitly, identifying the leaders of Pharaoh's occult court as Janus and Jambres. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. I offer it as that, one tradition's record. But the Apostle Paul confirms these exact names centuries later in the New Testament. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 8, Paul writes, "Now as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth." Reading, not inventing. The names are real. The resistance is real. But watch what the text does with their power. Look at the Hebrew word for enchantments in Exodus 7:22. The word is lat. It comes from a root meaning to wrap, to muffle, to cover in secrecy. It is the exact same root used elsewhere in the Bible when a sword is wrapped in a cloth. Janus and Jambres are not wielding raw, creational authority. They are using muffled, deceptive, demonic mimicry. They can only imitate judgment. They cannot create life. Picture it. The great sorcerers of Memphis, dripping with gold and lapis lazuli, standing over a ruined bowl, thinking they have matched the God of the Hebrews. But all they have done is agree with him. All they have done is participate in the execution of their own river. God turned the Nile into a graveyard, and Pharaoh's own priests proudly helped him dig the hole. The demonic realm always cannibalizes itself. Pharaoh turns his back and walks into his house. The text says his heart was hardened. He does not care that his people are choking on the stench. He only cares that his magicians proved he still had teeth. But the blood does not recede when the sun goes down. A terrifying ticking clock begins to run across the Egyptian sands, and the Bible gives us an exact, agonizing timeline for the suffering. The magicians retreat into the shadows, leaving an entire nation to claw blindly at the dirt, begging the earth to give them what the river will not. What exactly happened during the unbroken, silent week that followed? On the second morning, the shock wears off, and the animal instinct for survival takes over. The grand, sunlit avenues of Memphis are empty. The citizens of the empire, from the palace guards to the stonemasons, are on their hands and knees in the mud. They are clawing at the earth, begging the ground to give them what the river will not. Exodus chapter 7 Verses 24 and 25, King James Version, locks in the timeline of their desperation. And all the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the river. And 7 days were fulfilled. After that the Lord had smitten the river. Stop right there. Read that again. 7 days. An unbroken, suffocating week of thirst. The mighty Egyptians, the overseers who beat the Hebrew slaves with rods, are now reduced to groveling in the dirt. Look at the Hebrew word for digged in verse 24. The root is chafar. It means to dig, but its primary use in the Old Testament is to search out, to explore, to pry into a secret. They are not just scratching the surface. They are trenching deep into the very banks where they used to drown Hebrew infants. Same dirt, same banks. They are searching for life in the exact soil where they planted death. They are living out the dark prophecy of Jeremiah, chapter 2, verse 13, where rebellious men have hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns, that can hold no water. They dig the trenches, but the water that seeps into the holes is infected. The earth itself refuses to filter the guilt. Picture it. A nation choking on the stench of its own rotting God. The book of Jasher expands on the sheer agony of this week. It records that the thirst became so absolute, the Egyptian taskmasters were forced to go to the Hebrew camps and beg for water. Jasher and early rabbinic writings carry a stunning tradition about these 7 days. They claim that if an Egyptian and a Hebrew drew from the same well, or even drank from the same cup, the liquid was clear water for the slave and thick blood for the master. The only way an Egyptian could wet his cracked lips was to purchase the water directly from a Hebrew, paying in silver and gold. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. I offer it as that, one tradition's record. But sit with that image. The economic power of the empire is instantly inverted. The slaves become the merchants of life, the masters become the beggars, and the duration of the plague is not arbitrary. 7 days is the exact length of the biblical creation cycle. In Genesis, Yahweh spent 7 days ordering the world, separating the waters, and bringing life out of the deep. Here, on the banks of the Nile, he reverses the clock. He spends 7 days uncreating Pharaoh's kingdom. He takes the pristine waters and collapses them into chaos and death. Reading, not inventing. The week of silence is a theological mirror. The empire is being unmade. The week of thirst breaks the pride of the streets, leaving a trail of blood-soaked trenches along the shoreline. The 7 days finally expire, and the blood begins to clear. But as the river returns to water, what permanent, inescapable testimony has the exhumed Nile left branded on the mind of Egypt? Go back now to the riverbank where this film began. The morning sun breaking over Memphis. The 80-year-old shepherd standing in the reeds. The wooden staff coming down hard on the surface of the water. You have read that scene 100 times. A Sunday school miracle, a divine show of force designed merely to make a king thirsty and break his economy. But tonight, you know the name of the dark principality Moses assassinated in the current. You know why the stone pitchers shattered in the bedrooms, and that thick, clotting water is not just a ruined natural resource anymore. It is a resurrected crime scene. When the 7 days finally ended, the blood dissolved. The Nile flowed clear again. Pharaoh went back to his throne room. His magicians went back to their shadows, and the empire tried to pretend it had just survived a freak of nature. But the river had spoken. The damim, the plural bloods of the slaughtered Hebrew sons, had cried out from the riverbed and forced a mirror in front of a murderer. Same river, same victims. The earth finally refusing to hide what it was forced to swallow. I hold this as one reading, not the final word. I am not handing you new doctrine to replace your scripture. I am handing you the ancient Hebrew, the secular papyrus, and the silent week, and letting you sit with the weight of it. We know why the water bled. We know why the wooden idols could not protect their own bowls, and why the magicians were forced to participate in their own ruin. But the current is still holding the rest. The exact number of the boys cast into the reeds, the full magnitude of the bones, buried deep in the delta silt. The Nile will keep that secret until the very end of the age. If you made it to the end of this study, comment the word "watched," subscribe to the channel, so we can keep opening these ancient texts together, and send this to one person who loves the Exodus story, but has never heard what the river was actually hiding. The river always remembers what the empire tries to forget.